What is the greatest commandment? Friends, welcome back to another gospel reflection. Here, we're going to discuss what the greatest commandment is, and in particular, why this is the greatest commandment. So basically, if you have to summarize the greatest commandment into one word, it is this: love. It is love. If we have to summarize all the law into one, it is the law of love. Specifically, to love God and to love your neighbor. Now, before we get started, just a reminder to please subscribe to this YouTube channel to receive weekly reflections and also various other talks and discussion on faith and theology throughout the liturgical year. I'll be posting in many different kinds of videos and podcasts, all in English, so don't miss out. Okay, let's get started. Notice that all four of the Gospels make reference to the greatest commandment. Here, we're going to reflect on the passage of the greatest commandment from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 22, verses 34 to 40. Now, recall that earlier in this chapter 22 of the Gospel of St. Matthew, the Pharisees and their disciples came to Jesus and they tested Jesus by asking him different questions, one of which is this: is it lawful to pay the census tax to Caesar or not? And Jesus' response is to render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God. Now, if you're interested in listening to this reflection in more detail, I'll put a link to it in the description below. So let me set up the scene for you so that you can understand well the context of this question of the greatest commandment in the Gospel of St. Matthew. As you can see that at this point in the Gospel, the Pharisees and the disciples are looking for every possible way they can to entrap Jesus so that they can bring some charge against him. Keep this point in mind. Jesus loves the Pharisees, just like he loves all people, especially sinners who are willing to change and convert. And so rather than taking the criticism of Jesus, rather than reflecting on them and change, because it is all constructive criticism, insofar as Jesus is speaking the truth about the behavior of the Pharisees, they refuse to do so. They are hypocrites who need to change, but they refuse to do so. And in refusing to do so, they also want to silence Jesus by putting him to death. Their plan is to do this by asking Jesus a series of questions with the intent of entrapping him. So among the many questions they asked Jesus, one which we're exploring now is this: what is the greatest commandment? Well, consider this. We always ask, what is the greatest of anything, right? We're always searching for what is that number one thing. Not the number two, just the number one. What is the greatest? So we ask, for example, what is the greatest mountain on earth? Or what is the greatest store in the world? Or what is the greatest vacation? Or perhaps we may even ask more practical things, such as what is the greatest car? Or the greatest house? Or the greatest phone? Or the greatest computer, etc., right? Here's the thing. So oftentimes, the greatest of anything is very subjective. For example, the greatest car for one person is not the greatest for another. And same thing goes with a house, a computer, or any materialistic things. In other words, the greatest of anything depends on how we view it. And in this sense, it is subjective. But at the same time, however, there are certain things that are simply the greatest, such as this very question right here. What is the greatest commandment? It is to love God and to love your neighbor. In fact, if you go to google.com and you Google in what is the greatest car or what is the greatest cell phone or the greatest house, different things will come up because it is subjective. However, if you go to Google right now and type in what is the greatest commandment, you get mostly different articles that explain the greatest commandment. And it's this: Love God and love your neighbor. And so consider this very commandment. It has truly endured the test of time. It's been around for thousands of years, and it is considered the greatest commandment. It also stands the test of culture. Even though many cultures place values on different things such as hard work, getting a good education, being a friendly person, etc., this commandment still stands above all the values. The commandment to love God and to love your neighbor. In fact, there's an anonymous quote that says, "To love is to be human." Or another version of it is this: to love and to be loved is what makes us human. So in essence, when we examine the greatest commandment, to love God and to love our neighbor, they are the greatest commandments because they are the foundation of all the laws. They are so fundamental, in fact, that if we have to reduce all the laws into just one, it's this: love God and love your neighbor. Now, we can say in words that we love God and we love our neighbors, but words are not enough. They must be interiorized. They must change our heart, our mind, and our life. It is only in practicing this law, that is the law of love, that we can truly demonstrate our love to others. Because it's not just in words, but in action as well that demonstrates our love. If you say to your spouse or a family member or a friend, "I love you," well, that's nice. But then consider this: do you really love them? And if you say yes, then let me ask you, how do you prove your love for them? For example, you say to your husband or your wife, "I love you." Okay, well, prove it. How would you do it? Would you buy them nice gifts? Would you spend time with them? Would you serve them? These are just some of the external manifestations, external examples, right, that demonstrate our love through action. It's how we show our love to others. Now, keep in mind, this commandment is not just love God or love your neighbor, right? It's not an either or. It's to love God and to love your neighbor. They are both connected because in loving God, you demonstrate that love through loving your neighbor. And by loving your neighbor, you love and honor God. Now, I have friends who are agnostic or who don't believe in God. They say, "Well, I don't believe in God. Does that mean I'm off the hook for this commandment?" Well, the greatest commandment is twofold. It's the love of God and love of neighbor. But let's see how these two are related. In order to love God, you have to demonstrate that love by putting it into practice. And by putting it into practice by loving your neighbor. So this is the greatest commandment because they are connected. Take a look at the first letter of John, chapter 4, verses 20 to 21. Here's what it says. "If anyone says, 'I love God,' but hates his brother, he is a liar. For whoever does not love a brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. This is the commandment we have from him. Whoever loves God must also love his brother." Now, as we can see, these are strong words. In order to love God, we must love our brother, our sister, our neighbor, everyone, right? And whenever I talk about this, I always get someone who raised their hand and asked this question. Well, my brother or my sister or my neighbor doesn't love me. In fact, sometimes they even say, well, my brother, my sister, my neighbor hates me. They want to damage my life. They want to do all sorts of evil things to me. How can I love them? Now, I know this is not always easy, and it's true that all human relationships are not always easy. Pretty much everyone can agree to this. But here's what we can do. You can't control how the other person feels about you, but you can control how you feel about you. And this can help you to be a better person. Now, I know there's so much more that's packed into this question. We'll just have to explore it another day. But the reality is this: focus on what you can control. Now, here's something else that's important to consider in this reflection. In order to love someone, you must know about that person, right? Consider this. Have you loved someone you don't know? Or maybe you just love them at first sight, right? But the point is this. In order for you to love someone, you must know about that person first. And then you continue to fall deeper and deeper in love. And it's the same thing with God. In order for you to love God, you must first learn about God, know more about Him, etc. And in knowing Him, you end up loving Him, loving God and your neighbor. Now, here's another question to consider. Do you love your neighbor? Do you know your neighbors? Do you know your neighbor to the right? Do you know your neighbor to the left? Do you talk to your neighbors? These are just some of the questions for us to consider as we learn to love. You see, love is not just an emotion. It's not just a feeling. By going deep, it means serving and offering what we can for the other without counting the cost in return. And so the whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments, as the Gospels say, because the center of which is love. And allow me to add, everything else, all the laws, all the prophets through the ages, through the generation, fall into this very commandment, to love. And so reflect on this question. How do I love God and my neighbor this day? May God bless you.